Hey everyone, welcome back to Behind the Veil. And in this episode, we are going to be going over the death of Joseph Smith. But real quick, before we do that, I want to quickly show off our website once again. So here, it's the Church Expositor, or churchexpositor.com. Here, we've got links to all of our previous episodes. We've got products now, which is super exciting. So you can click through these. We've got bags, we've got hoodies, we've got shirts. And you can click here to view all of the products, and you can see so many of our products. You can sort by category, whatever you guys would like. It's probably going to be here. And if you have any suggestions for merch, feel free to leave a comment down below, and we will see if we can get something made for you. Also, up here we've got a link to our coffee page, which will also be separately linked down below in the description, where you can donate to us and help us out. So any donation, any purchase of products really helps us out and keeps this going. So anything at all, we appreciate so much. But enough of yammering on about that. Let's dive back into today's episode of Joseph Smith's death. The events surrounding the death of Joseph Smith and his brother Hyrum Smith are not as cut and dry as the LDS Church would like everyone to believe. The general belief peddled by the church to its members is that Joseph Smith was a martyr of the one true restored religion on earth, and that his death was enacted by an angry mob motivated solely by their persecution of Joseph and the members of his church. Well, hang on, not so fast. In this podcast, we are going to detail how Joseph tried to seduce his friend's wife, order the destruction of a printing press, was in debt $5 million at the time to creditors, and had ordered Danite violence towards non-member residents of Missouri, and encouraged members to steal from those he deemed as Gentiles, amongst a host of other crimes that ultimately led to his death. All of which had nothing to do with persecution. So let's start with the charges against Joseph Smith that led to his incarceration at Carthage jail, and we will detail reasons for these charges as we continue on through this episode. The first one we have is destruction of a printing press, which was the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor. We've got treason against the state of Illinois, and finally inciting a riot. So let's begin with the destruction of the printing press. The story begins with William Law. William Law served as the first counselor in the first presidency of the church. He was first called to be the first counselor in 1841, and he was a close associate of Joseph Smith. It was commonly known that William Law was very opposed to Joseph Smith's doctrine of polygamy. But what most don't know is that Joseph was actively trying to convince William Law's wife to become one of his plural wives. In a book by Joseph H. Jackson in 1846, he states, "I have related above, 15th of January, 1844, that Joe informed me in conversation that he had been endeavoring for some 2 months to get Mrs. William Law for a spiritual wife. He said that he had used every argument in his power to convince her of the correctness of the doctrine, or of his doctrine, but could not succeed." He goes on to say, "He then tried to persuade me to aid him in his purposes. Mrs. Law said that he would employ any stratagem in order to accomplish his object, and went on to say that he and Emma had both tried to persuade her of the correctness of the doctrine, but that she would not believe it to be of God. I told him that he must carry his plot himself, for I would have nothing to do with such things." William Law's opposition to the church and to Joseph Smith was far more than just his adamant opposition to polygamy. Joseph Smith had actually betrayed their friendship by seeking to make William Law's wife another one of his polygamous wives. LDS apologists claim that William Law's statements about Joseph Smith and the church cannot be trusted because he was an apostate and was excommunicated from the church. But this is an overly simplistic dismissal of William Law by LDS apologists who don't want to face the facts of Joseph Smith's appalling betrayal of William?
Yeah, I think they try to characterize William Law and his Nauvoo Expositor, which you can purchase and you can read what he had to say, but they try to dismiss it because of the fact that he was excommunicated. But the reality is, when you know what Joseph's behavior was, it becomes very obvious why William was so upset. There are several accounts given documenting Joseph's betrayal of William Law and seeking to take his wife as Joseph's own wife. William Law provided affidavits and interviews in which he explicitly stated that Joseph Smith had approached Jane Law to become a plural wife. And there was an 1887 interview with the Salt Lake Tribune. And in this, William Law claimed that Joseph Smith had proposed to Jane Law in early 1844, which caused a deep personal offense and led to his opposition to Joseph Smith. Who can blame this man for being in opposition to Joseph Smith when he's proposing to his wife? This interview was frequently cited in discussions about the event and can be referenced in the Richard S. Van Wagner's book, Mormon Polygamy, A History. It's also referenced in Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling by LDS historian Richard Bushman. Richard Bushman is an apologetic LDS historian, but his examination of the controversies surrounding Joseph Smith paint quite a different picture than the whitewashed LDS narrative that's sold to members. Bushman discusses how Smith's proposals to married women was a significant contributing factor to the fallout with William Law. So you even have an LDS historian willing to admit that Joseph Smith had done this, and it was a big issue. So William Law was excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on April 18th, 1844. His excommunication was primarily due to his opposition to Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy, which I find ridiculous to excommunicate someone for this, and his anger at Joseph Smith's proposal to his wife. So we have the key reasons that were given for his excommunication. Number one was his opposition to polygamy. Law strongly objected to Joseph Smith's introduction of plural marriage or polygamy. He viewed the practice as immoral and against the teachings of the Bible. His refusal to accept this doctrine put him at odds with Smith and other church leaders who were secretly practicing and promoting polygamy. Number two, he accused them of doctrinal deviations. Law opposed what he saw as significant doctrinal changes under Joseph Smith's leadership, particularly the concept of exaltation, the belief that humans could become gods, and other theological shifts. Law felt that these changes deviated from traditional Christian teachings, which they absolutely do. And number three, it was concerns over Joseph's political power. William Law became increasingly concerned about Joseph Smith's political ambitions. Smith had declared himself a candidate for the presidency of the United States, and Law feared that Smith's consolidation of religious, political, and military power in Nauvoo was dangerous. Law accused Smith of seeking too much authority and being tyrannical in his leadership, which we will talk more about how he was, in fact, very tyrannical. If you watched our video on the Danites, you will understand more fully how accurate and valid William Law's concerns were over Joseph Smith's tyrannical leadership. Another one was there was a disagreement with Joseph Smith's authority. William Law grew critical of what he perceived as the authoritarian and increasingly autocratic nature of Joseph Smith's leadership. You have to realize, if a man was going to marry another wife and enter into polygamy, Joseph Smith had to choose the wives, and there was a lot of control that was going on with people's marriages and people's private lives that Joseph was interfering with. You will also see that in Lucy Walker's life and in her family, how Joseph Smith very much interfered in their lives as well. Law believed that Smith was using his position to control and manipulate members of the church into polygamy, is one of them. Joseph Smith's betrayal, last one, of William Law. There were also personal conflicts between William and Joseph Smith. William had reported reportedly refused Smith's offer to participate in polygamy, which led to tension between them. Additionally, Law and his wife, Jane, were offended when Joseph Smith proposed to Jane Law as a plural wife, which was a significant personal betrayal in William Law's eyes because they were friends.
Looking at all this, William Law had valid concerns about Joseph Smith and his behavior. The excommunication of William Law is an approach the LDS Church takes towards those who try and expose harmful behavior, and this practice still continues to this day. For a modern example of the LDS Church's attempts to silence those who dare ask questions about dishonest and harmful practices, we have Nemo the Mormon's disciplinary council this past week and eventual excommunication a few days after. This is a prime example of how the church has always silenced anyone who dares question them, even if their concerns are 100% valid. So anyway, jumping back to William Law, he played a crucial role in the publication of the Nauvoo Expositor, which was a newspaper designed to expose what he viewed as Joseph Smith's corrupt practices, including polygamy and misuse of political power. The Expositor accused Smith of being a false prophet and raised concerns about his political ambitions. Here we have a simple overview of the events leading to Joseph Smith's arrest. First, Joseph Smith asked to share William Law's wife. According to Annalisa Webb in her book, Wife Number 19, Jane stated Smith visited her at night when he knew Law would not be home and proposed to her, suggesting it was God's will that she enter into a polyandrous marriage with him. Annalisa Webb Young's account states that Jane Law said that Smith had asked her to give him half her love, and she was at liberty to keep the other half for her husband. She refused Smith's request to marry him as a polyandrous plural wife.
I just have to say, that is so disgusting. Give me half of your love? Ugh.
Exactly.
Absolute betrayal of a friend.
No kidding. Like, the first counselor in the first presidency. It's insane. And then we've got on January 8th, 1844, William Law received the unexpected news that he was no longer the first counselor in the first presidency. After petitioning his case on April 18th, 1844, he was informed he was excommunicated on the grounds of apostasy the day after. His wife, Jane Law, was also excommunicated that same day. The excommunication of William and Jane Law was a way to attack and discredit those who disagreed with Joseph Smith and who dared to question him and refuse his proposals. As we detailed in our video on polygamy, I highly recommend that everyone go check that out. Joseph threatened to destroy the reputation of Nancy Rigdon, who refused his proposal. This is how Joseph handled anyone who did not want to approve of his lascivious lifestyle. Now we've got the Nauvoo Expositor. The single issue was published in Illinois under the direction of William Law on June 7th, 1844. William Law felt it was his duty to expose Joseph Smith's polygamy and secretive practices to the community. Joseph Smith, then being the mayor of Nauvoo and a presidential candidate, ordered that the Nauvoo Expositor printing press be destroyed, and it was destroyed on June 10th, 1844. Then we've got Joseph Smith declaring martial law outside the bounds of his authority. He tried to escape, but returned when Emma wrote him a letter telling him his followers would see him as a coward. Oh, and no, Joseph wouldn't allow anyone to think of him as coward or think of him negatively in any way.
Yeah. So he did try to flee the charges, is what he was doing. When the charges came down and arrest warrants were issued, he tried to flee. So on June 25th, 1844, all 16 members of the Nauvoo Council were arrested for instigating a riot. All were released the next day except Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith, who were kept on charges of treason and conspiracy against the state of Illinois. On June 27th, 1844, the mob murdered Joseph Smith. He shot back. A lot of people are not aware of that Joseph did have a gun in his possession. He died falling from the window, being shot, and falling from the window, and had a Jupiter talisman with him, which is just an interesting kind of little bit of information because those are considered pagan in nature. He was into occult practices, and that Jupiter talisman would definitely have been an occult item that he had with him. So let's look at the charges against Joseph Smith that led to his arrest and incarceration in Carthage jail. The charges against Joseph Smith in the months leading up to his death were numerous, and they absolutely had nothing to do with persecution because of religion. In May of 1844, Joseph Smith was charged with perjury, fornication, and polygamy. We know that the fornication and polygamy are 100% correct. We have documented evidence of that. The church fully admits it. So we know that these charges were, he was guilty of those charges. A Hancock County grand jury indicted Smith for perjury, fornication, and polygamy. The charge of perjury was based on testimony by Joseph H. Jackson, which we read a statement from him earlier, and Robert D. Foster. William Law's testimony led to the charges of fornication and polygamy. Joseph Smith appeared before the circuit court, but the trial was postponed because a material witness, Withers, was not present. Therefore, the trial was postponed until the next term of the court. And you can find this in BYU Studies information. The link is there. Charges of inciting a riot and destroying a printing press, the Nauvoo Expositor. So in the History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Volume 6, Joseph Smith writes in chapter 20, page 432. So this is in Joseph Smith's own handwriting. Monday, June 10th, 1844. I was in the city council from 10 a.m. to 1:20 p.m. and from 2:20 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. Investigating the merits of the Nauvoo Expositor and also the conduct of the Laws, Higbees, Fosters, and others who have formed a conspiracy for the purpose of destroying my life. The council passed an ordinance declaring the Nauvoo Expositor a nuisance and also issued an order to me to abate the said nuisance. I immediately ordered the marshal to destroy it without delay, and at the same time issued an order to Jonathan Dunham, the acting major general of the Nauvoo Legion, to assist the marshal with the Legion if called upon to do so. So I want to point out here, the Nauvoo Legion was basically a Mormon militia group. Okay. About 8 p.m., the marshal returned and reported that he had removed the press, type, printed paper, and fixtures into the street and destroyed them. So I want to point out here really quickly, when we talk about a riot, when you think about the riots that you've known in your lifetime, what happens? People break into buildings, drag out property, burn it in the street, destroying property. That is what we see as a riot even today. This is what these people did. Joseph Smith ordered him to go in, break into this building, take out a printing press, the paper, all the fixtures, and destroy them. And that's what happened. That is why he was accused of inciting a riot. And he 100% in his own writing, in the History of the Church, in his own writing, he claims he did this. So in his own words. And this was for the sole reason that they were publishing a paper that spoke out against him. He also states very clearly that he did request the support of the Nauvoo Legion, a Mormon militia, if necessary. So the charges of ordering the destruction of the printing press are entirely accurate. He has admitted it, and he was in fact guilty by his own words.
Yeah. And as far as the charge of inciting a riot, the reason for the charge of inciting a riot involves the fact that Joseph ordered the destruction of the printing press, and it was violently destroyed in the streets. But after the press was destroyed, no immediate violence took place. The destruction of the printing press did spark outrage and accusations that Smith had violated constitutional rights and freedom of the press. This outrage is what set off the series of legal and political actions that led to Smith's arrest on charges of destroying the printing press and inciting a riot. On both accounts, Smith's actions did violate freedom of the press and his order of a marshal to violently destroy the printing press did in fact spark outrage among the residents. And Joseph Smith's charge of treason in June 1844 was directly linked to his actions following the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor when he enacted martial law. After the Nauvoo City Council, with Smith as mayor, ordered the destruction of the printing press, he and others were initially arrested on charges of riot. However, tensions escalated as opponents of Smith feared his growing political and military power. Because military power is completely understandable because they have the Nauvoo Legion, which was a decent-sized group, and we'll get into that later. Following the arrest for inciting a riot, Joseph Smith, fearing mob violence, he declared martial law in Nauvoo on June 18, 1844, and called out the Nauvoo Legion, which was a large militia, and this act of declaring martial law was interpreted as an armed rebellion against the state of Illinois, leading to the charge of treason. Under Illinois law, treason was defined as levying war against the state, and Smith's command of a militia under martial law was seen as fitting this definition. Smith and Hyrum were arrested for treason on June 25, 1844, based on accusations from individuals including Augustine Spencer and Henry Norton, who claimed that Smith's actions posed a threat to the state government.
Yeah, definitely declaring martial law. He was essentially trying to protect himself. But anyway, so I want to detail the arrest warrant that was issued for him. It says, writ of arrest on the charge of treason, Joseph Smith, state of Illinois, city of Nauvoo, the people of the state of Illinois, to all sheriffs, coroners, and constables of said state, reading, whereas complaint has been made before me, one of the justices of the peace in and for said county aforesaid, upon the oath of Augustine Spencer, that Joseph Smith, late of the county aforesaid, did on or about the 19th day of June, 1844, at the county and state aforesaid, commit the crime of treason against the government and people of the state of Illinois aforesaid. These are therefore to command you to take the said Joseph Smith, if he be found in your county, or if he shall have fled, that you pursue after the said Smith into another county within this state, and take and safely keep the said Joseph Smith, so that you have his body forthwith before me to answer the said complaint and be further dealt with according to the law. Seal, given under my hand, this 24th day of June, 1844, R.F. Smith, J.P. So what many members are unaware of is that Joseph was constantly crying persecution. And you'll find this in the Joseph Smith papers and other places where he's always saying, oh, they're persecuting me. When in reality, the opposition to the saints had very little to do with their religious beliefs. People did not care. There were new churches coming up all the time. There were religious revivals. There were a lot going on religiously at the time. It was more about their antagonistic and violent behavior. So in a Missouri Legislative Committee meeting, in the notes, they detail the abhorrent behavior of the Mormons against other Missouri residents. And this is a quote from this meeting. It has been represented to them that the examining courts have sent on for further trial many of the class of citizens called Mormons, charged with various crimes and offenses, under the charge of treason, 6 for murder, and as accusaries thereto before and after the fact, 8 for other felonies, 8 for the accusations of other things, and then 27 for other felonies. Special terms of the circuit court are expected to be held in the several counties in which the above mentioned crimes are represented to have been committed. Grand juries will then have those charges against said people before them and must act upon the same documentary evidence, which the committee would necessarily be compelled to examine. So here we have in these documents, it very clearly stating that the Mormons were not being unfairly persecuted. In the committee notes, they are addressing issues with the Mormons involving treason, murder, and 27 cases of other felonies that have been committed by the Mormons. They were not innocent, peaceful people that were being persecuted. This is absolutely a false representation.
And here we've got a sworn statement given by James G. Owens in 1838. The statement says, James G. Owens, a witness produced, sworn, and examined on behalf of the state, deposeth and saith, in this morning of the day that the militia arrived at Far West, I heard Joseph Smith Jr. in a speech to the Mormon troops saying that he did not care anything about the coming of the troops, nor about the laws, that he had tried to please them. If they had lived together, it wouldn't please them. If they scattered, it wouldn't please them. That he did not and try to keep the, and it's blank there, but I assume it's saying keep the peace, to please them any longer. That they were so damned set, and God should damn them, so help him Jesus Christ. So, of course, again, we've got Joseph Smith saying that God should damn them, damn them. Joseph Smith, he loves his damning people, and you can check it in many of our previous videos, and Joseph Smith says the same thing. And it continues on here to say that he meant to go on them as he had begun, and take his own course, and kill and destroy, and told men to fight like angels, that heretofore he had told them to fight like devils, but now told them to fight like angels, that angels could whip devils. I think in this speech it was that he said that what they lacked in numbers, the Lord would make up by sending angels, and sent 2 angels where they lacked 1 man. He swore considerably, and observed that they might think that he was swearing, but that the God Almighty would not take notice of him cursing such a damned set as they were.
This is total classic Joseph Smith. Like, oh, God's not going to care about these bad things that I'm doing. I'm justified. It's fine.
Exactly.
He does this with polygamy and everything else. It's ridiculous.
It really is.
Yeah.
He further stated that they pretended to come out as a militia, but that they were all a damned set of mobs.
Man, his favorite word.
He really is. He stated at that or some other time that as they had commenced consecrating in Daviess County, that he intended to have the surrounding counties consecrated to him, that the time had come when the riches of the Gentiles should be consecrated to the saints. While the last of expedition was in progress in Daviess County, a portion of the troops returned to Far West, to whom and to the people assembled, I understood, Sidney Rigdon had read a letter from Joseph Smith Jr. We'll get into that in just a moment. But one thing I want to point out here is Joseph Smith is saying that the riches of the Gentiles should be consecrated to the saints. The riches of everyone else needs to be given to the saints, which is...
We've mentioned this several times, that this is why they had so many problems everywhere they lived, because Joseph Smith said stuff like this. And you can find it in the Joseph Smith papers and other church documents, him saying this. So,
exactly. And it's just insane. So you can go check out several of our previous videos, specifically the Joseph Smith crimes video, and you can definitely see all of this in more detail. We're just going to briefly breeze over it today because this is mostly regarding Joseph Smith's death. And the statement continues on. I asked him to read it to me, which he did, and it was near as I can recollect as follows: that the enemy was delivered into their hands, and that they need not fear, that this had been given to him by the spirit of prophecy in the name of Jesus Christ. Sidney Rigdon appeared to rejoice at that information, and give unto the thing. A few days before the militia got to Far West, Joseph Smith Jr. observed that he did not intend to obey the laws any longer, that he had a great many writs served on him, and that he was of age and did not intend to have another served on him, and further this deponent saith not. Here again, we have Joseph Smith saying that he does not intend to obey the laws any longer. No wonder everyone else is so mad at him, because he's doing so many awful things.
When did he obey the laws? Polygamy was against the law at the time. He hasn't been obeying the laws. I don't know what he's talking about any longer.
Seriously.
Like, dude, you have not been following laws. This is why you're in trouble already. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Anyway, so to give some more validity to the statement that was just read by James C. Owens, there's a statement directly from the Joseph Smith papers. And I want to read this statement to you. It says, "My brethren, as you have been chosen to be our leading men, our captains to rule over this last kingdom of Jesus Christ, who have been organized after the ancient order, I have called upon you here today to teach you and instruct you in the things that pertain to your duty, and to shew you what your privileges are, and what they soon will be. Know ye not, brethren, that it soon will be your privileges to take your respective companies and go out on a scout on the borders of the settlements, and take to yourselves spoils of the goods of the ungodly Gentiles. For it is written, the riches of the Gentiles shall be consecrated to my people, the house of Israel, and thus waste away the Gentiles by robbing and plundering them of their property. And in this way we will build up the kingdom of God, and roll forth the little stone that Daniel saw cut out of the mountain without hands, until it shall fill the whole earth. For this is the very way that God destines to build up his kingdom." What? Oh, these innocent Mormons that are being told by their prophet, you can find this in the Joseph Smith papers, he is telling them to take of yourselves the spoils and goods of the ungodly Gentiles, rob and plunder them of their property. This is a problem.
So apparently
It is
God.
very,
Oh, go for it.
yeah, go on.
Oh yeah. So apparently God is saying, oh, he's going to build up his kingdom based on all these stolen goods. I thought in the Bible it was specifically saying, "Do not steal
Do
from
not
your
steal.
neighbors." Like,
Exactly. I think that's a great point. It's like God says don't steal, but then God tells Joseph. Well, God tells Joseph all the things, right? We find in the Book of Mormon that polygamy is bad, and then Joseph's like, but God said I can. Yeah, it's very clear that the Mormons were being encouraged to steal and to rob and plunder people. It is very clear that the Mormons were absolutely not a peaceful people, and they were not being persecuted for their religion. Their attitudes towards other people who were outside of their church were very hostile. This was absolutely not a case of religious persecution. Joseph was constantly claiming this. It was not. It was a case of hostility between Mormons and other citizens of the cities that they were living in. Tension grew between Nauvoo and neighboring towns such as Carthage and Warsaw because of the political power that the Mormons were gaining, as well as the hostilities against those that were considered, quote, Gentiles. So they were having hostilities against neighboring towns, which now, as we read Joseph Smith's statement, you can understand why there's mounting tension between these towns. And it had nothing to do with anybody's religion. It's centered around Joseph Smith. He was not only, quote, the prophet of the Mormon church, he was also the mayor of Nauvoo. He was a commander of a militia group, the Nauvoo Legion. He was a justice of the peace and a university chancellor. He was amassing so much power to himself. It was of concern because of the rhetoric against the people of the other towns and neighboring areas. To the non-Mormon community, this concentration of power was extremely concerning. Nauvoo grew almost overnight from a little village of religious refugees to a point where it rivaled Chicago as the largest city in Illinois. After the destruction of the printing press and the arrest on charges of inciting a riot, Joseph and his brother Hyrum were released on a habeas corpus that was issued before an LDS tribunal. Joseph Smith frequently used habeas corpus to defend himself from legal challenges during his time in Nauvoo. The Nauvoo City Council, which was under Smith's leadership, passed an ordinance in July 1842 granting Nauvoo citizens access to writs of habeas corpus through the municipal court. This allowed Smith to appeal his arrests to the Nauvoo's court rather than being subject to courts outside the city. If he were subject to courts outside of Nauvoo, he would have to face a jury of unbiased individuals. But by creating the ordinance allowing access to habeas corpus with an all-Mormon tribunal, he could escape facing consequences of his criminal behavior.
One of the most notable instances occurred in June of 1843, when Missouri authorities attempted to extradite Smith on charges related to the 1838 Mormon-Missouri War. So Smith was arrested, but he invoked the habeas corpus before a Nauvoo tribunal, which allowed him to challenge his detention. And this legal mechanism resulted in his release multiple times, as Nauvoo courts consistently ruled in his favor because Nauvoo courts were stacked with members of Smith's church. These actions, however, contributed to the growing tension between Nauvoo and Illinois authorities, which eventually led to Smith's final arrest in Carthage. Joseph Smith's attempt to evade legal consequences is a well-documented, yet often controversial part of his history. In 1844, the Mormon prophet faced increasing legal pressure from both local authorities and disaffected members within his own movement. However, before surrendering, Joseph Smith made efforts to flee and avoid justice, only to be persuaded by his wife, Emma Smith, to turn himself in. In June 1844, Joseph Smith was facing mounting accusations. One of the most significant charges against him was for ordering the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor, a newspaper that had published scathing critiques of Joseph Smith's leadership and plural marriage practices. This act of suppressing free speech enraged locals and brought legal action against him. Rather than immediately facing these charges, Smith sought to evade arrest, like he always does. And according to historian Fawn Brody, Smith had intended to flee to the west, possibly to the Rocky Mountains, where he imagined he could establish a new Mormon stronghold. And that was in a book called No Man Knows My History on page 396. As Smith prepared to flee, a group of his closest followers accompanied him. However, while crossing the Mississippi River, his wife Emma intervened, urging him to surrender. She believed that running away would only make matters worse for both him and the Mormon community. In a letter to her husband, Emma reportedly wrote, "If you love me, you will do as you have said and surrender yourself to the authorities." Her plea highlighted a tension between Smith's desire for self-preservation and the impact of his actions would have on his followers, especially in Nauvoo. Joseph was actively criticized by some of his followers for attempting to run. After he was criticized by some followers, Smith returned and was reported to have said, "If my life is of no value to my friends, it is none to myself." And this was in a manuscript written by Willard Richards and George Smith and their assistants, as finished in 1858. So under pressure from Emma and other associates, Smith reluctantly returned to Nauvoo. Despite his fears, he believed he could negotiate his way out of imprisonment. On June 25th, 1844, Joseph Smith and his brother Hyrum were arrested and taken to Carthage jail to await trial. Smith believed that his political connections and influence would offer protection, but as history showed, this was not the case. Governor Thomas Ford, wary of Smith's power, made it clear that the law would be enforced. Ford later recalled, "I had assured the prisoners of protection, but as things turned out, it was impossible to restrain the mob."
Yeah, there's a lot of apologists that try to say that it was caused by the lack of protection given by the government and that the government allowed it to happen, which is why we get the oath of vengeance and the temple endowment and all of that. So anyway, while he was in Carthage, Joseph Smith continued to hope for rescue, but it was not forthcoming. Joseph and Hyrum were held in Carthage jail, awaiting trial for the destruction of the printing press, inciting the riot, treason, and all of that. There was question whether Joseph Smith did, in fact, order the Nauvoo Legion to march on Carthage jail. So Alan J. Stout, who was a former Danite and member of the Nauvoo Legion as well, both of these are Mormon militia groups. Now, there began to be excitement in the regions roundabout, so that the Nauvoo Legion was called out, which occupied my time as I had command of one company of footmen. The mob was determined to have the prophet, and we were determined they should not. So we kept under arms day and night for many weeks, but finally Joseph and Hyrum gave themselves up to be tried by the persuasion of false brethren and were taken out to Carthage. And while they were in jail, brother Joseph wrote an official order to Jonathan Dunham to bring the legion and reserve him from being killed. But Dunham did not let a single man or mortal know that he had received such orders. And we were kept in the city under arms, not knowing, but all was well, until the mob came and forced the prison and slew Joseph and Hyrum and wounded John Taylor severely. So we have a member of the Nauvoo Legion stating that Joseph Smith did, in fact, order them to come and break him out. But then we move on to Mormon historian and niece of the 9th LDS president, David O. McKay, Von Brody, and she says this: dull and heavy-spirited, the prisoners finally sent for some wine, and all except Hyrum sipped a little. By the way, this is also in other history of the church, that they were in fact drinking wine the day that they were killed. When Richards handed the bottle to the guard, he started down the stairs. At that moment, there was a noise at the outer door, followed by shouts to surrender and the sound of shots. It was not the Nauvoo Legion galloping up for a dramatic rescue. For some reason never divulged, Jonathan Dunham had pocketed the order and neglected to act upon it. And no other man in Nauvoo knew of his prophet's peril. It was the men of the Warsaw militia who had marched out of the town as a token to the governor, waited until he was well on his way to Nauvoo, and then came roaring back to join the Carthage Greys. I think it's important to point out that it's well documented that Joseph Smith drank wine in Carthage jail on the day of his death. Many LDS members believe that Joseph Smith followed his own word of wisdom. They tell these faith-promoting stories of how when he was a child going to have surgery on his leg, he refused the alcohol, and how he was so special and whatever. He never abstained from alcohol, tobacco, or coffee during his lifetime. We have documented accounts of him riding through town, smoking a cigar, drinking whiskey, drinking wine. And in our last episode, we detailed how Brigham Young stated that Emma tried to poison Joseph's coffee, which is against the LDS word of wisdom. So we're not going to go into how Joseph never followed his own revelations for the sake of time, but I just think it's important to point this out here.
Mm-hmm. And now let's jump over to the events that were taking place at the jail. As Joseph, Hyrum, William, and John Taylor remained imprisoned before a trial could be held, a mob of about 200 armed men and their faces painted black with wet gunpowder stormed Carthage jail in the late afternoon of June 27, 1844. Early on June 27th, Smith authored an order to the Nauvoo Legion commander, Jonathan Dunham, instructing him to bring the Legion to Carthage and stage a jailbreak. LDS members claim that Joseph Smith, like the Savior himself, was falsely accused and was humbly submitting himself to his accusers and went like a lamb to the slaughter.
That is seriously laughable. Jesus was not ordering his own militia to come and save him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my word.
The facts just simply do not in any way, shape, or form support this. Joseph Smith, like we've said, tried to flee from the arrest warrant put on him. And when he finally turned himself in, like we said, he's trying to stage a jailbreak by calling on the Nauvoo Legion. And also, like we've mentioned earlier, he had a pistol delivered to him to fight. Nothing about this resembles Christ or someone submitting to martyrdom, as the LDS Church tries to claim. Joseph Smith and the other prisoners were guarded only by 6 members of the Carthage Greys, led by Sergeant Frank Worrell. A division of militia began marching away from Carthage, but soon received orders from the governor to disband. This was claimed during a trial in the testimony of Benjamin Brackenbury on May 26, 1845, and evidence suggests that those sent to guard the jail were disbanded by orders of the governor. So when the mob was seen approaching the jail, the jailers became alarmed, but Joseph Smith, mistaking the mob for the Nauvoo Legion, told the jailer, "Don't trouble yourself. They've come to rescue me." It's very clear here that Joseph fully expected the Nauvoo Legion to break him out of jail. And there's absolutely no sign of humility or submitting himself to his accusers here. Joseph had every intention of escaping. Smith did not know that Jonathan Dunham, the Major General of the Nauvoo Legion, had not dispatched the unit to Carthage to protect him. Alan Joseph Stout later contended that by remaining inactive, Dunham disobeyed an official order written by Smith after he was jailed in Carthage. And from here we kind of know the story. Joseph Smith was hit by a ball, shot from a gun, and Smith fell from the second-story window. The Carthage Greys reportedly feigned defense of the jail by firing shots or blanks over the attackers' heads, and some of the Greys even reportedly joined the mob who rushed up the stairs. And this was documented by Dr. Quinn D. Michael in a book on Being a Mormon Historian and Its Aftermath, and a few other books. Again, all of our sources will be on our blog on the website. The mob first attempted to push the door open to fire into the room, though Smith and the other prisoners pushed back and prevented this. A member of the mob fired a shot through the door, and Hyrum was shot in the face, just to the left of his nose, which threw him to the floor. He cried out, "I am a dead man," and collapsed, and he died instantly. So I do want to make a comment here real quick, that if Hyrum was shot in the face, it's highly unlikely that he would have been able to say, "I am a dead man." But as always, we will let you guys decide what you think actually happens and what you guys find to be plausible. So here we got Smith, Taylor, and Richards attempting to defend themselves. Taylor and Richards used a long walking stick in order to deflect the guns as they were thrust inside the room from beyond the door. According to A History of Illinois, Joseph Smith was furnished with a 6-barreled pistol by his friends and fired several times as the door was burst open, and his shots wounded 3 of the assailants. So Taylor was shot 4 or 5 times and was severely wounded, but he did survive. LDS members generally believe the story that John Taylor's life was spared by a pocket watch, and which miraculously stopped one of the shots fired at him. And this watch is displayed in the LDS Church History Museum in Salt Lake City, Utah. The watch was broken and was used to help identify the time of the attack. But in 2010, forensic research by J. Lynn Lyon of the University of Utah and Mormon historian Glenn M. Leonard suggested that Taylor's watch was not struck by a ball, but rather broke against a window ledge. Because looking at this watch, this is not shot. It says struck by a ball. That just means it was basically shots with the guns that they had at the time.
Yeah, if anybody who has ever used a gun or target shooting or whatever would be able to clearly ascertain that this pocket watch was absolutely not hit by a bullet of any kind. The damage is so minimal, and the hole in it is just so tiny. It didn't destroy the watch. You can still see the watch. The screen, like the glass is cracked, obviously, and there's a little kind of hole in it, but it's so small. It just is absolutely laughable that anybody would have ever believed that this was shot by a bullet. John Taylor's pocket watch is often hailed as this miraculous object that saved his life during the mob attack. And I heard these stories when I was a member. I heard these stories as a kid. The claim is that the watch was struck by a bullet and it stopped the projectile and thereby spared John Taylor from certain death. However, upon examining the watch and the story, many have pointed out inconsistencies that cast doubt on this version of events. Like I reported before, the level of damage to the watch does not align with what you would expect from a bullet impact at close range. Skeptics have argued that the watch exhibits only minor dents and scratches, far from the catastrophic destruction a bullet would cause. And this was actually written in Fawn Brody's book, No Man Knows My History. Given the lethality of weapons used during the attack, the relatively minor damage to the watch suggests either embellishment or an outright fabrication of the story. Moreover, photographic evidence of Taylor's watch, which is still preserved today, you can see pictures of this watch, further undermines this narrative. As historian Richard Abenes points out, the photo of the watch shows damage far too minimal to be consistent with a high velocity bullet strike. And this is under One Nation Under God's book that he wrote. The idea that a bullet could strike such a small, fragile object without completely destroying it strains credulity. The watch, with its thin metal casing, would likely have been obliterated by the force of the bullet, leaving far more than just a dent. The story of Taylor's pocket watch thus appears to be another example of how Mormon leaders have embellished events to perpetuate a narrative of divine intervention and miraculous survival when the physical evidence tells a much more mundane story. Now, we have stories from modern prophets doing this exact same thing. If you want an interesting one about Nelson, look into his airplane crash story, and you'll find another instance of this type of fabrication. Richards, who was physically the largest of Smith's party, escaped unscathed. Lyon speculates that after the door opened, Smith was in the line of sight and Richards was not targeted. I do believe that Richards was not targeted for some reason. I don't know why. There's a lot of speculation on that. After using all of the shots in his pistol, Joseph Smith made his way toward the window as he prepared to jump down, is what people are claiming. I really don't think that we know what was in Joseph's mind at the time, that we know what he was thinking. But Richards reported that he was shot twice in the back and that a third bullet fired from a musket on the ground outside hit him in the chest. Taylor and Richards' accounts both report that as Smith fell from the window, he called out, "O Lord, my God." Some have alleged that the context of this statement was an attempt by Smith to use a Masonic distress signal. An 1851 lithograph of Smith's body being mutilated in the Library of Congress. There are varying accounts of what happened next. Taylor and Richards' accounts state that Smith was dead when he hit the ground. Eyewitness William Daniels wrote in his 1845 account that Smith was still alive when members of the mob propped up his body against a nearby well, assembled a makeshift firing squad, and shot him before fleeing. Daniels' account also states that one man tried to decapitate Smith for a bounty, but was prevented by divine intervention, an affirmation that was later denied. So we're just kind of giving you different, statements by different people. You can decide what you think happened. According to modern leaders of the church, thunder and lightning frightened off the mob. Do you really think thunder and lightning are going to frighten a mob? Like, we've all been out in thunder and lightning. That's ridiculous. But anyway, mob members fled, shouting, "The Mormons are coming," although there was no such force nearby.
So after the whole attack was over, Richards, who was trained as a medical doctor, went back to see if anyone besides himself had survived, and found Taylor lying on the floor. Richards dragged Taylor into the jail cell. So they weren't originally held in a jail cell. They were actually held in the guards room across the hallway. So Taylor dragged him under some of the straw mattress to put pressure on his wounds and to slow the bleeding. And he went to get help, and both Richards and Taylor survived. Taylor eventually became the third president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Richards had escaped all harm except for a bullet grazing his ear. Joseph and Hyrum's younger brother, Samuel Harrison Smith, had come to visit the same day, and after evading capture from a group of attackers, is said to have been the first Latter-day Saint to arrive and helped attend the bodies back to Nauvoo. And he died 30 days later, possibly as a result of injuries sustained while avoiding the mob. So there are many claims that Joseph Smith may have killed some of the attackers. Like we said earlier, he did have a gun and he did fire back, but did he actually kill any of them? John Taylor states in the history of the church that Joseph Smith killed 2 of his attackers. He says, "Brother Joseph instantly arose with a firm, quick step and a determined expression of countenance, approached the door, and pulling the 6-shooter left by Brother Willock from his pockets, opened the door slightly and snapped the pistol 6 successive times. Only 3 of the barrels, however, were discharged. I afterwards understood that 2 or 3 were wounded by these discharges, 2 of whom I am informed died." And again, this is in the history of the church, Volume 7, page 104, and this is also posted on BYU Studies. This has led many to believe that Joseph killed two of his attackers, but John Taylor either lied or was wrongly informed. So there is some discussion on Reddit, and someone mentioned this. This claim is ruled out by the historical record. Other than this rumor repeated by Taylor, there is no evidence in the historical record that Smith killed anyone at Carthage. On the contrary, the historical record rules this out. So there was an extensive trial of the alleged murders of Joseph Smith. The main evidence against three of the defendants, John Wills, William Voorhees, and William Gallagher, was the fact that they had been shot. They had bullet wounds, but they did survive. There is no evidence in trial documents indicating that anyone was killed. The fact that you have Taylor saying only 3 shots were actually fired, and they were 3 known wounded survivors, with no actual evidence of other fatalities, this rules out any conclusion that anyone was actually killed by Joseph Smith. And as we've gone over, Joseph Smith did not go as a lamb to the slaughter, so as he so self-righteously claimed he did. Joseph called on the Nauvoo Legion, like we've said, to break him out of jail. He also had a weapon, fired several rounds into the mob, wounding 2 or 3 of them. Rather than going as a lamb to the slaughter, he was actively fighting for his life. And like we've mentioned before, Joseph's last words. According to the accounts of both John Taylor and Willard Richards, the 2 eyewitnesses who survived the mob's attack on Carthage jail, Smith's final words were, "O Lord, my God."
Yes, and this becomes important as we move on. So Joseph Smith, this is an account in the official history of the church that records Joseph seeing that there was no safety in the room and no doubt thinking that it would save the lives of his brethren in the room if he could get out, turned calmly from the door, dropped his pistol on the floor, and sprang into the window when 2 balls pierced him from the door and one entered his right breast from without. And he fell outward into the hands of his murderers, exclaiming, "Oh Lord, my God." You can see how apologetic and how they make him seem so righteous that he's trying to save everyone else in the room. How do they know that? Joseph died. He never said, "I was thinking I wanted to save the other people in the room." We have no idea whether or not this was his reasoning or what he was thinking. He died. He had no opportunity to say what he was thinking in that moment. So they're creating this very righteous narrative where we don't have any evidence to support that was his reasoning. But going on, John Taylor reported, and this is canonized in LDS scripture in D&C 135, verse 1, Hyrum was shot first and fell calmly, exclaiming, "I'm a dead man." Joseph leaped from the window and was shot dead in the attempt, exclaiming, "O Lord, my God." They were both shot after they were dead in a brutal manner, and both received 4 balls. This is another really interesting aspect, saying that they were both shot after they were dead. And this is in canonized scripture. Willard Richards' testimony was that 2 balls pierced Joseph from the door, and one entered his right breast from without, and he fell outward, exclaiming, "O Lord, my God." So we keep seeing this "O Lord, my God" exclamation. They're all saying this. As his feet went out of the window, my head went in, the balls whistling all around. He fell on his left side, a dead man. The final moments of Joseph Smith's life have been steeped in controversy, particularly concerning his last words. As the mob stormed Carthage jail on June 27, 1844, witnesses report that Smith, in an act of desperation, cried out, "O Lord, my God." So what is this? A phrase that has been interpreted by many as a Masonic distress call. This phrase closely mirrors the Masonic plea for help. "O Lord, my God, is there no help for the widow's son?" This has led to widespread speculation that Joseph Smith, who was a Freemason, was invoking the Masonic Brotherhood in a final attempt to be spared by any potential Freemasons that may have been in the mob. Historian Fawn Brodie, in her critical biography of Joseph Smith, notes that Smith's cry was unmistakably a Masonic call for help. Joseph Smith had joined the Masonic fraternity in Nauvoo only a few years earlier, and Masonry had deeply influenced the symbolism and rituals that he incorporated into the Mormon temple endowment. Masonic scholar, this is where it gets really, really, really important. Masonic scholar Alan Roberts explains that the plea, "O Lord my God," was an integral part of the Masonic distress signal, used by Masons in moments of grave danger when they sought the assistance of fellow Masons. So this is in Alan Roberts' book, The Craft and Its Symbols, page 142. Joseph Smith's use of this cry at the moment of his death strongly suggests that he was appealing to his Masonic ties for protection, perhaps hoping that members of the mob would recognize the call and show mercy. Rather than embodying the image of a martyr dying for his faith, this Masonic plea paints a very different picture. One of a man relying not on divine intervention, but on secret society allegiances. It challenges the narrative of Smith's death being solely a religious martyrdom, revealing instead a man attempting to utilize every possible connection to save his own life.
And another thing, the day that Joseph Smith died, he was not wearing any of his garments. So one of the more glaring contradictions in Joseph Smith's life as a self-proclaimed prophet is the fact that at the time of his death in Carthage jail, he and his companions were not wearing their temple garments. The temple garments, introduced by Joseph Smith himself as a part of the sacred temple endowment ceremony, were meant to be a protection for the faithful, both spiritually and physically. According to Mormon tradition, the garments were to be worn at all times by devout members, offering protection against evil and harm. However, when Smith faced his final moments, he had either removed or chosen not to wear them, a fact that calls into very question the efficacy and importance of these supposedly sacred items. And I know a lot of people today would be like, oh, garments aren't meant for physical protection, yada, yada, yada. When they were first introduced, they were specifically stated to provide both spiritual and physical protection. It was only within the last, I shouldn't say several years, but at this time that it was specifically stated to be physical protection. And here we've got historian Michael Quinn points out that none of the four men in Carthage jail, Joseph and Hyrum Smith, John Taylor, and William Richards, were wearing their temple garments when they were attacked by the mob. The absence of garments is at such a critical time raises significant doubts about whether Smith truly believed in the spiritual significance or protective power he had ascribed to them. If garments were as sacred and protective as he claimed, why would the prophet and his closest followers choose not to wear them in what was clearly a dangerous situation? And this contradiction only deepens when one considers some of the broader implications. Willard Richards, one of the few survivors of the mob attack, later testified that he believed the garments would have been of no use in protecting them that day. Historian Richard Bushman notes, Richard later remarks that it was providence, not garments, that saved him. Such statements diminish the claims of supposed divine power provided by wearing the garments, revealing fundamental inconsistencies in one of the core symbols of Mormonism. The failure of Joseph Smith and his companions to wear their garments at the time of their deaths suggests that even they may not have truly believed in the sacred nature and the protections they preached to their followers.
Yeah, I think that one's a huge one. And of course, as a member, you never know this. And you're constantly, I was taught, so actually, I'm obviously older than you are. I was taught by my parents and other people that garments would provide physical protection from harm. It was not just this idea of spiritual protection. I know they've changed that. It's been in my lifetime that narrative has changed. I know a lot of millennials and younger people will say, oh, we've never been told that. Yeah, you haven't, but you're also very young. So there's a lot of things about the church that you may not have heard, but those of us that are older than you, this is what we were taught. And yes, I was absolutely taught that. And it is very difficult for people when they're leaving the church and taking these garments off. For older members, there is a lot of fear of, like, you're not wearing your garments and you're driving in the car. A lot of them will have fear of getting in a car accident or having harm come to them because they weren't wearing them. And it's definitely a lot of emotional harm that's been done with this. You know, you go swimming and you're like, I've got to get them back on so I don't get in a car accident on the way home. So yes, they absolutely did teach that. So moving back into the story, despite Emma's efforts to have him surrender peacefully, Smith's controversial leadership and attempt to flee contributed to the heightened tensions that ultimately led to his death. This episode in Joseph Smith's life exposes the underlying conflicts and contradictions in his character. His attempt to escape, only to be convinced by his wife to surrender, suggests a man torn between his own survival instincts and the need to protect his fragile legacy. The image of a prophet trying to outrun justice contradicts the narrative of divine authority and responsibility that Smith often claimed he had. In the end, Joseph Smith's decision to stay, largely influenced by his wife Emma, sealed his fate. Then, as we move in after Joseph Smith's death, controversy surrounding Joseph's death does not end here. Brigham Young takes the controversy surrounding Joseph's death to a whole new level when he writes the Oath of Vengeance into the temple endowment, which essentially equates to treason against the United States. In 1889, the temple endowment contained an oath of vengeance, which required endowed members of the church to, quote, never cease to pray that God would avenge the blood of the prophets upon this nation. So this is the exact wording that was in the 1889 temple endowment. You and each of you covenant and agree that you will pray and never cease to pray, Almighty God, to avenge the blood of the prophets upon this nation, and that you will teach the same to your children unto the third and fourth generation. All bow your heads and say yes. One of the more controversial and revealing moments in the history of the LDS Church's political involvement came when Apostle Reed Smoot ran for a seat in the U.S. Senate in the early 20th century. Smoot's candidacy ignited a fierce national debate, not only because of his high-ranking position in the LDS Church, but also because of the secretive and troubling practices within the LDS Temple, particularly the so-called Oath of Vengeance. This oath, which was a part of the temple endowment ceremony at the time that Reed Smoot went through for his own endowment, called upon members to seek vengeance upon the United States government for the blood of Joseph and Hyrum. This is treason. As Smoot faced hearings before the U.S. Senate, the oath became a central focus of accusations of disloyalty and treason. During the Senate hearings, Smoot was forced to respond to claims about the secretive oaths taken in LDS temples, including this Oath of Vengeance. Apostle Heber J. Grant, among others, admitted that the oath had been part of the endowment. And he stated, yes, the oath to avenge the blood of the prophets was required, which I find extremely troubling, that these people that claim to be peaceful, they claim to be like Jesus, and they're requiring people to take an oath of vengeance. The fact that a high-ranking member of the church was required to take such an oath, pledging retribution against the government, cast serious doubts on Smoot's ability to serve loyally in the Senate without a conflict of interest. It raised concerns about whether Smoot and other Mormons were more loyal to the church or to the nation, leading to widespread public distrust.
And these hearings exposed the dangerous blending of religious fanaticism and political ambition in the LDS Church, when church leaders trying to play both sides. Despite their efforts to downplay the significance of the Oath of Vengeance, the fact that such an oath existed at all reveals the deep-seated hostility towards the government within the church's highest ranks, and a very treasonous attitude of those willing to take such an oath. Historian Kathleen Flake observes that the Smoot hearings forced the LDS Church to distance itself from its more extreme doctrines, but the damage had already been done. The Oath of Vengeance was eventually removed from the endowment ceremony in the 1930s, and was yet another instance of the church's troubling history of defying and even threatening the authority of the United States government. So, in addition to the oath of vengeance in the LDS Temple endowment, hymns were written in worship and praise of the so-called prophet, including antagonistic statements against the state of Illinois.
I do have to point out here, the LDS Church always claims that they do not worship Joseph Smith. But yeah, Brigham Young makes claims that, and my mother has even told me this, that no one will get into the celestial kingdom without the approval of Joseph Smith. They sing praise to the man. If you read the words of many hymns that they sing in worship service on Sunday, they sing hymns to Joseph Smith. That is something entirely reserved for God and any other church. And yet in the LDS Church, they sing hymns of worship to Joseph Smith during their worship services.
It's so
Just an
true.
interesting fact. Yeah, and this is one of those hymns that they wrote. And they sing. I have sang this in sacrament meetings, in worship services, many, many, many times throughout my life.
Yeah, so have I. So when the song Praise the Man, it was originally written in 1844, and that original statement, or original song, says, "Long shall his blood, which was shed by assassins, stain Illinois, while the earth lauds his fame. Praise to his memory, he died as a martyr. Honored and blessed be his ever great name. Long shall his blood, which was shed by assassins, stain Illinois, while the earth lauds his fame." These statements against Illinois were later removed in the 1927 version of the hymnal, and it was changed to "Praise to his memory, he died as a martyr. Honored and blessed be his ever great name. Long shall his blood, which was shed by assassins, plead unto heaven, while the earth lauds his fame." So, like we said a moment ago, the church is like, we don't worship Joseph Smith, it's fine. But they have songs to him and saying that that his blood shall stain Illinois.
What bothers me is to say praise to his ever great name. That sounds like something you would say to God.
Yes.
Not to this man. It's very blasphemous in my opinion.
Exactly. And they were taught by Brigham Young, like we said, that no one will enter in celestial glory without Joseph Smith's approval. I have to say here that they have definitely elevated him to a level of worship that he certainly does not live up to or qualify for or anything. But we'll leave that for a topic on another day. The church, via John Taylor, published statements that their blood will stand as a witness against the wicked for vengeance. So here we've got D&C 135, verse 7. It says, "Their innocent blood, with the innocent blood of all the martyrs under the altar that John saw, will cry unto the Lord of hosts till he avenges that blood on earth." This is a vengeful attitude towards Joseph Smith's killers, but it also contradicts the lamb to the slaughter image the church tries so hard to maintain. Compare this attitude to that of Jesus in the Bible, who said, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do."
That is such a stark contradiction.
Absolutely.
It is such a stark contradiction. It in my opinion, it's extremely offensive that the church tries to compare the two.
Absolutely. Like the LDS Church is trying to say, you know what, we are Christian, but then we get things like this. Like, it's insane. And the attitude of the early church leaders, and specifically Brigham Young, did not reflect a Christ-like Christian attitude in any way, shape, or form. And as we've detailed here, the death of Joseph Smith is far more complicated than one of an innocent, humble, so-called prophet who was martyred for his religious beliefs. In fact, his religious beliefs had nothing to do with the charges against him. There was ample evidence for a whole host of crimes that he had committed. And we've done a whole video on his crimes. I highly recommend that everyone go check that out.
That's a good one.
It is a really good one. But this is where we'll leave it off for today because we are running out of time. And we will leave it up to you to decide what you believe based on the information we have provided today. So again, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to check out our website, churchexpositor.com. Also, we're going to be starting doing a lot more posts on Instagram and TikTok as well as several other social medias. So make sure to check us out there. But again, thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you next time.